Good morning. I want to invite you to turn with me, if you would, to Luke, the 21st chapter this morning. I'm sorry, 22. 22. Luke chapter 22 and verse 39, if you'll read with me there. And Jesus came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. And when he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, "Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but thine be done." Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently. And his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. And Jesus said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray, that you may not enter into temptation." Who are you? I mean, who are you at your core, really? When we find ourselves under pressure, when we find ourselves in the press, when we find ourselves with heavy decisions or heavy anxieties pressing upon us, that's when our real substance comes out, doesn't it? I mean, that's when you see who we really are at our core. When we read of Jesus here in the garden, we're reading of him under pressure. We're finding him at a crisis. And he is showing in this crisis who he really is. At the same time, you could make the argument that who you really are is who you are all the time. That it doesn't matter whether there's a crisis. It's who you are in the mundane things of life, when there's not something that's pressing upon you. But who you are who you are every day, the everyday person you are, is who you really are. You might make the argument that who you are is who you are when nobody's watching, when nobody's with you, when nobody sees. Or you could say it's who you are when people are watching, when you have eyes upon you, and that your behavior doesn't change when you have an audience. Well, who we are really is who we are in all those circumstances, right? I mean, it's who we are when no one's watching, when we're all by ourselves, when there is no audience, when we're all alone. Who we are in private is who we are at our core. And that same person that we are when we're all alone is the person that we carry into public when we're together with other people. And it's in those private moments, the way that we behave, that determines how we're going to behave when we do have an audience, when there are other people around, when they are watching. Whether we, when we are in public, are still pursuing a private audience with God, even when we're in the company of other people. Who we are every day is going to have a lot to do with who we are when we find ourselves under pressure. Because it's in the practice of everyday life, when there isn't pressure, when there is the freedom to choose and to use the discretionary time and the opportunities that are a part of our day, when those are before us and there's nothing pressing upon us that makes us anxious or that causes us to focus on the things that matter most, it's that we choose what matters most in those moments that prepares us for those crisis moments where what matters most really comes out. I want to say to you that there are three things that define who you really are. One of those is your priorities. A second thing are your relationships. And the third thing that really defines who you are the choices that you make. Your priorities, your relationships, and your choices. And I want you to see that all three things are amplified in the text before us. When we look at Jesus in the garden, when we look at His priorities, when we look at His relationships, when we look at His choices, we really find who Jesus is here, who He really is at the core. And it's a good model for us to examine who we really are at our core, to examine our priorities and our relationships and our choices in light of what we see Jesus prioritizing, choosing in terms of relationships, and choosing in terms of whose will He's going to follow here while He's in the garden. Let's think for a moment, first of all, about priorities. Jesus he is going to die. I mean, He's come to the end of His journey. And what He chooses to do with His final hours, with the moments that He has before He goes to the cross, are an indication of what it is that matters most to Him, right? And so could I ask you this question in light of your priorities? I mean, what really matters most to you? What really matters most to you? And what is it for Jesus? What is it that really matters most to Jesus? Is that indicated by how He behaves in the garden? Is it clear when you see Him in the garden what it is that really matters most to Him? What is it you really have to do today? That you have to do? That you can't not do? And what is it that you really have to do every day? I mean, aren't those the things that are our real priorities? It's the thing that I won't compromise. No matter what else I have to do, this is the thing that must get done today. Now, you and I have both shown over the course of the week behind us what it is that really mattered to us. I mean, I might make a different list than the way that I lived this last week. If you ask me, what are your priorities? What matters most to you? But what really matters most to me, I have lived out this week. And what really matters most to you, you have lived out this week as well. You've shown each day what it is that really mattered to you by the things that you had to get done, by the things that you didn't let slip, by the appointments that you kept, by the things that you did first, the things that you did last, the things that you did through the day. And what Jesus shows while He's here in the garden is that what matters most to Him is this time alone with God. What matters most to Him is this pursuit of His relationship with His Father. And He is going to be alone with God before He goes to the cross. And He is not going to let anything get in the way of that. But the thing that I admire that we learn here in the text is that this isn't just something that Jesus does just because He's at the end. Look at what it says in verse 39. It says, He came out and He proceeded as was His custom to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed Him. I mean, this is what He would have done if it wasn't Friday. I mean, if it wasn't Thursday night before the Friday when He's crucified. This is what He did Wednesday night. This is what He did Tuesday night. This is just what He did as they left the city of Jerusalem to go where they were staying while they were there. This is what His habit was. This is what His custom was. That's the reason why Judas is going to know where to lead the soldiers to have Him arrested, right? I mean, how did Judas know where they could find Him? Well, he knew that this is what Jesus does at the end of the day. When they're in Jerusalem, He goes to the garden and He prays. And so because this is His habit, Judas knows that's where they're going to find Him. And so the priorities of Jesus are what create the vulnerability here for Him to be arrested by Judas and who's his betrayer. Because Judas knows where he's going to be because he knows what his habits are or what his customs are. Could I say to you that our habits, I mean the things that we have to do every day, aren't those indications of our priorities? I mean, when I get my TV watching done, have I not said something about what really matters to me? When I get my chores done, or when I get my gardening done, or when I get my car washed, or the things that I make sure get done this week, That's a testimony to what it is that really matters. And being alone with God, communing with Him, was something that really mattered to Jesus, and He always got it done. And because He got it done when days were ordinary, then of course when we find Him under pressure, and when He has the most anxiety, and when there is the most fear, and when there are the most eyes watching, when there is the biggest pressure, where does His heart fly? It flies to God. I mean, this is the thing that matters most to Him. But the priority is there regardless of the pressure, regardless of whether it's an ordinary day or whether if it's a super ordinary day. This is just what Jesus does. And our priorities establish who we really are. What is it that really matters most to you? The second thing that we see in terms of Jesus' behavior here is that who He is defined by His relationships. Who is it you really like to be around? Who is it you really like to be around? And who it is that you really like to be around are going to be, those are going to be relationships that you prioritize, and they are going to determine who you are, right? Because you're like the people that you're around. Look at the relationships that matter to Jesus in terms of how He behaves in the garden. Where are the multitudes at? They're all with their families. They're all in other places. They're having their own Passover meal tonight. Probably by this time, most of the people, most of the crowds, most of the multitudes are in bed. But Jesus is awake. And where are the other disciples? They're not with Jesus. Jesus has just been with the 12 tonight. The other disciples are not with Him. They also are spending the Passover with their family, and they're in other places. But Jesus has with Him those relationships that matter most to Him. And even these disciples, this band of 12, are nearer to Him than even His own family. And so the support that He gets from these spiritual ties is crucial in His life. It's indicative of who He is, who He's with. But when He comes into the garden, we're not told in Luke's account, but we find in the other Gospels that He left Judas when they left the upper room. And they come to the garden, and so it's Jesus and 11. But 8 of the 11, He leaves at a place, and He brings 3 of the disciples in with Him a little closer. And Jesus' inner circle of Peter, James, and John is indicative, again, of who He is. Who He lets into His inner circle is a sign of who Jesus is. But these are relationships that mattered to Him. These are men to whom He could bare His soul. These are men who knew who He really was, who saw Him in every circumstance in life. They're close to Him. Who's in your inner circle? I mean, who are the people that you take to you when you go to the hospital? Who are the people that are with you when you're facing difficult times? Who are the people that you invite to pray for you when you need prayer? Who are the people that you invite in to give you counsel when you need advice? I mean, those people are indicative of who you really are. Does the picture of your inner circle look something like Jesus' inner circle? But when Jesus has come in, even with the 3 disciples, He goes a bit further, about as far as you can throw a rock, we're told. Luke says He went a stone's throw. So He went as far as you could throw a rock by Himself. Because there's a relationship that matters most to Jesus, more than even those 3. And that's His relationship with God. You know, the cross is about Jesus and us, right? The cross is about Him reconciling us with God. But the garden is not about Jesus and us. The Garden of Gethsemane is about Jesus and God. Because there's nobody that gets what He's about to undergo except for God. There's nobody that understands what he's about to face. There's nobody that can go where he's going to go except for the Father. There's nobody that gets what it is that he's about to endure, but the Father understands. And there's no relationship that's going to be put more on test in these next moments than the relationship that he has with the Father. And Jesus demonstrates here the relationship that is most vital to him. His relationship with God is the most important. And if it weren't for Jesus and God, there would be no Jesus in us. If it weren't for the vitality of his relationship with his Father, there would be no relationship that we would have with the Father. Do you see that his relationship with God is the foundation for everything else that he's able to do? It means that he has victory in temptation. It means that he loves us so much that he would give himself for us. It means that he can be a servant. It means that he can overcome the grave. The relationship with the Father is the foundation for all else. Now, what is that like for you? I mean, is your relationship with the Father, is it the first thing? Is it the foundation? And when you whittle away everything else, when you take away family, and when you take away brothers and sisters in Christ, when you take away your inner circle, what is left? Are you and God at the core of all that? If it's not you and God at the center, then some relationship is out of sorts. It's out of place. My relationship with God it needs to be at the center of that. It needs to be who I really am, as Jesus models for us here. But if that is not the case every day, listen to me. I mean, if that's not the case for you on Monday, if that's not the case for me on Tuesday and Wednesday, it won't be the case for me on Thursday night when I'm in the garden. It won't be the case for me when I find out that I've got some kind of besetting illness. It won't be the case for me when I'm in some kind of financial crisis, or when I'm in some kind of straits, or when I'm under some kind of pressure that tests my mettle. If it's not who I am every day, it's not going to be who I am when I'm in the crisis. The third thing that we see that defines who Jesus is here in the garden are his choices. And it's choosing. It's whose will is going to reign. That's at the crux of the crisis that Jesus is experiencing here. He says in verse 41, he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me, and yet not my will, but thine be done. And an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. Jesus is struggling here with whose will? Whose will? And you and I, we have that choice to make all the time, don't we? Whose will is going to reign? Is it going to be my will, or is it going to be God's will? And it's not like Jesus doesn't want to do God's will, but what doing God's will is going to mean. The fate of all humankind has rested at two pivotal moments in history on what happened with two people alone in a garden. Two people with Eve in the beginning, and with Adam's choice there, and with Jesus here in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in both cases, there is the wrestling in the garden about whose will is it going to be? Is it going to be my will, or is it going to be God's will? And I can just see, can't you? I mean, the serpent wound around one of those olive trees where Jesus is praying and trying to whisper into Jesus' ear, "Are you kidding me? You're the Son of God? And this is what's going to happen to you? This is what your Father is asking of you?" Do you see those guys? I mean, those guys that are your disciples, those men that are your inner circle, what are they doing right now? They're not praying with you. They're not caring about what you're about to. They're sleeping. And the whole city is sleeping. And outside of the city, the whole world is sleeping. And this is what you're going to do? Are they worth all of that? But Jesus trusts that the pain of carrying our sin, and what that's going to mean in terms of violating His relationship with God, the pain of going to hell for us, of going through hell for us, He surrenders here to God's will. In spite of all the distractions and all the enticements, of making His own choice. Who you really are comes down to the choices that we make all the time about whether it's going to be my will or whether it's going to be God's will. Whether I'm going to trust in my own way and my own power and my own design and my own purposes, or whether I'm really going to surrender to God's will and to God's purpose in my life. I wish that I had the words to succeed in this for every one of us in what I'm about to suggest. I wish that I had the words that I could remove in all of our minds and in all of our hearts this morning the distraction of being together with each other. The distraction of whatever it is in your work that worries you, whatever it is in your family that occupies your mind, whatever it is about your health, whatever it is about other cares. I wish I could strip away from your heart this morning and from my heart this morning everything else and think about the fact that when all is said and done, the one thing that matters is you and God. The one thing that matters is me and God. And when it comes to priority, I mean, He is it. He's the first. Seeking Him, that's the only thing that matters. And in terms of relationship, the only thing that matters, and that will make all other relationships what they ought to be, the one thing that matters is my relationship with Him. When I love God, when you love God most, we love all others best. It will make you the best husband and the best wife and the best father. When God is first in your life, then you will love everyone else the best. And the one choice that matters, the one choice, is His will. When His will reigns, there's going to be a victory. When His will reigns, there is no power that can overcome. Jesus learns in the garden the experience of total surrender and obedience to God. Total surrender and obedience to His Father. And He's a Lord of lords and King of kings, but He gives up here. And God gives Him victory in the giving up. And if we could learn that, if we could learn to give up, the Father gives up too. He shows the power of that. And if we could give up in trust to God, we'd find the victory that only comes when that's the way we define ourselves. When God is our priority. When His relationship is the relationship that matters most to us. When our choice is a choice of surrender to Him. When that's what defines us, do you see? That's who a child of God is. A child of God is one who in terms of priority seeks God. In terms of relationship, wants to know God. In terms of choices, surrenders to God. It's God's will. That is who Jesus is. And so He calls us to be. We're going to sing together this morning a song to invite anyone who needs the Lord in their life this morning to surrender in obedience to Jesus Christ. And wherever you are in your walk this morning, as we sing together, examine yourself, would you? The way our brother invited us to do at the table this morning. What matters most to you? What relationship is first in your life? What do you really want to do? And if your need is for God to be in your life this morning, then don't let anything else get in the way of seeing just you and God and your need for Him. Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?